Hello and welcome. Yet another Christmas story. This is a parody of Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is what really happened, and Dickens changed it into something else. So I thought I'd change it back. But which is the true version? I'm sure Charlie Dickens would approve of this. To get the best out of my interpretation, it is best to know Dickens's version. If you don't know it, read it or watch one of the films. They're pretty much the same, just this version is the true version. Or is it? The Real Christmas Carol by Al Donaldson. Written by me, read by me, copyright by me, Al Donaldson. Have a twirl. Oh, there we go. Oh. Marley was as dead as a coffin nail. Ebenezer Scrooge was very upset. Marley had died before he could repay the twopence he'd borrowed to buy a bun. It mattered nothing that Scrooge would inherit Marley's property and half of the business. A debt is still a debt and should be repaid, Scrooge mumbled under his breath. They lowered Marley's coffin into the frozen ground, and Scrooge overheard one of the grave diggers. There ain't no pockets in a shroud. What's his wealth done for him? Nothing. Common sense to most people, but to Scrooge it was a revelation. And he had an epiphany. For the first time that he could remember, he smiled at something not money related. Scrooge opened the office door, and a blast of cold air hit him in the face. It felt warmer outside in the snow. The thoughts he'd been having at Marley's funeral regarding life and the point of it started to make sense. Put some coal on the fire, Bob. Bob resented burning the coal. He was more content to put the lumps in his pocket to burn at home later. Bob wondered whether Scrooge was coming down with a fever. Are you feeling well, Mr. Scrooge? Never felt better, Bob. I pay you 15 shillings a week, don't I? Bob's stomach did a cartwheel. This was a fine time to cut his wages. It was Christmas. Yes, sir, stuttered Bob. I've been thinking. Bob braced himself. You've worked very hard for this firm, and as from today, I'm going to double your wages to 30 shillings. What do you think about that? Bob slumped to the floor. Please, Mr. Scrooge, don't be so unkind. It's hard enough to raise a family on 15 shillings a week. What? Bob looked up and Scrooge was smiling. You want to raise my salary to 30? Scrooge nodded. The conversation was disturbed by the ring of the bell over the door. Two strangers struggled through the entrance with puzzled looks. They wondered why it was colder inside than outside. Put some more coal on the fire, Bob. It's freezing in here. Yes, Mr. Scrooge. Now, gentlemen, what can I do for you? We're trying to raise a fund to provide food and drink for the poor at this time of year. Bob braced himself. for the onslaught that would occur. So many times people had come round collecting for charity, and Scrooge had reduced them to tears. Yes, of course. Would 100 guineas be all right? I'll write you a cheque. There was a sudden thud as Bob fainted to the floor. Scrooge stood up and looked over his desk at the inert Cratchit. Must be the cold. I did tell him to feed the fire. Two smiling strangers just nodded. 7 years later. A Merry Christmas, Uncle. Humbug! Exclaimed Scrooge, and offered a bag of sweets. Thank you, Uncle. Now, may I ask whether you'd consider buying more of the ink I can get from China? It's very reasonable. Alas, nephew, although it is very reasonable, the ink tends to fade after a few weeks, not very conducive for keeping records of those that have borrowed money. Never mind, Uncle. I have here the latest thing in multi-document copying. Scrooge gave his nephew an intriguing look. Bob Cratchit spent most of his time duplicating letters, and Scrooge was mindful of anything that would make his job easier. Now, yes, that does sound interesting. His nephew pulled out from his case a plank of wood in which 8 quills had been glued to the edge, 4 inches apart. Here we are, with this little beauty, the duplicating printer. Any clerk can duplicate up to 8 letters at once, only 17 shillings and sixpence. Scrooge looked in wonder at the device. Bob Cratchit was very impressed. What about the ink? How can you ink 8 quills at once? Aha! With this, and with a flourish, Fred produced a plank of wood with 8 inkwells 4 inches apart. Wow, said Bob. This is the Ink Master Supreme, suitably designed to be compatible with the duplicated printer, only 35 shillings and threepence. What will they think of next? Amazing, Bob said. Why is the ink side so expensive? I don't know. It always is. I think it's because it's new technology and they need to recoup the development costs. I'll think about it. Remember, Uncle, Christmas dinner is sharp at 3. I won't be late. I'll be visiting the orphanage first thing, and then on to Mrs. Crawford's House of Delights. They've got a new girl there, Isabella. What she can do with a toasting fork and a feather duster will make your eyes water. As long as you're there by 3, Merry Christmas, Uncle. Merry Christmas, nephew. I'll see you at 3. The blast of cold air as the door opened prompted Scrooge to say, Put some more coal on the fire, Bob. I suppose you'll want tomorrow off as usual, said Scrooge. If it's convenient, sir. Of course it is. It's only once a year. Tell you what, pop off now. Give your good lady a surprise. Thank you, sir. Bob didn't need telling twice. He had his coat, scarf, and hat on, and was halfway out the door before he said, I'll be in all the early the day after, sir. Don't bother. Get here when you can. Midday, if you like. Merry Christmas, Bob. Merry Christmas, sir. Scrooge looked at the clock. 6 p.m. Blow it, he thought. I'll pop round Mrs. Crawford's House of Delights tonight. Give Isabella the day off. Well, it is Christmas. Cheers. Christ. I'll pop into the jeweller's. I'm sure some nice trinket will give her a happy disposition. The walk home from Mrs. Crawford's was a little slower than usual. Each step made him wince, but the thought of Isabella and the toasting fork put a smile on his face. He wished everyone he met a Merry Christmas. He stopped at his front door, and as he came face to face with the knocker, it changed into the likeness of Jacob's Marley, and it spoke. Scrooge. Scrooge shook his head, and the face returned to being a knocker. As he climbed the stairs to his rooms, he heard a clanking of chains. He opened the door and was taken aback at the apparition sitting in an easy chair in front of the fire. The apparition spoke. Where the heck have you been? I've been waiting here since 6:30. It's now 11:15. Without blinking, Scrooge said, Out having a nice time. And as if he had to justify himself, added, It is Christmas, you know. Do you know who I am? Yes. When you were alive, you were my partner, Jacob Marley. But why are you covered in chains? I forged these chains link by link in life. Yours were as long as these 7 years ago. They are now more ponderous still. Why? What do you mean, why? Never mind. Continue. You will be visited by 3 ghosts. Why? Stop interrupting. They are for your redemption. Why? Why do you keep saying why? They will come because of your mean and grasping ways. I stopped being a skinflint on the night you died. What? I realized there you were, dead and rich and dead, and you got no enjoyment from the wealth you had. What? I do wish you'd stop saying what. I raised my clerk's wages. I donate to charities. I'm well respected round here nowadays. You can't do that. I've booked the 3 ghosts now. I can't just unbook them. Looks like you've got dreadful administration. They're 7 years behind the filing, and you can't contact any key members of staff. Well, it's not my fault. I came here to redeem you. Meanwhile, Bob Cratchit was very aware of Tiny Tim squirming on his shoulders. It could only mean one thing. They were no sooner through the door when Tiny Tim left off and announced, I've got to get to the privy. Mrs. Cratchit looked on at the disappearing figure of Tiny Tim. Take your jacket off, Bob. I'll get the cloth from the scullery and give it a wipe. The clock chimed 1, and Scrooge blinked awake. He realized someone was standing at the foot of the bed. I am the spirit of Christmas past. I am here for your reclamation. Take my cloak. If I must, sighed Scrooge. The room faded and reappeared as somewhere else. Good heavens! I know this place. I was at school here. I know those boys. That's Jenkins and Benjamin Fish and Tony Beck and Toby Bell. They are just shadows of things that have been. They are going home for Christmas holidays. The spirit led the way, and they both both passed through a wall into a classroom. There, sitting on his own, was a little boy. Why didn't you go home? My mother died giving birth to me, and my father hated me for it. Hold on a second. If you're all knowing, why am I telling you? And what is more, why aren't you pursuing those boys? What do you mean? They were my so-called friends, yet not one of them asked me to their home for Christmas. I hope you'll be haunting them like you're haunting me. I've not got so much as a card. It happened every year, neglected. Not one of them said, "Merry Christmas, come home with me, Ebenezer." It's something we should look into. We better get a move on. And the ghost waved his arm. Cheers. The view changed to the Christmas party at the business of Fezziwigs. Now this is where you claimed undying love to Alice, and then you told her to sod off, the ghost said gleefully. Yes, but 7 years ago I traced her to an opium den in the East End of London. Aha! You drove that poor woman to a life of destitution, drug-taking, and debauchery. Well, actually, no. She realized that I was right and money was king, and set about making sure she'd never go without any for the rest of her life. She brings in the opium by the ton and owns parlours all over the country. What? I do wish you'd stop saying what. You're as bad as Marley. The ghost waved its hand, and they were in Bob Cratchit's front room. "Dinner's ready, everyone," shouted Mrs. Cratchit. Scrooge and the spirit looked on. Mrs. Cratchit carried before her a large goose. Even the spirit of Christmas past was impressed. "I told you," said Scrooge, "I don't stint at Christmas." In a voice that was high enough to crack glass, Tiny Tim shrieked, "God bless us, everyone!" Bob Cratchit reached down and ruffled Tiny Tim's hair, and then wished he hadn't. He raised his glass. "God bless us, everyone," he said, as he wiped his hand on the seat of his pants. What a great year we've had. No one has caught tuberculosis, and we've managed to stave off rickets. And apart from a slight case of scurvy in March, we've come through the year unscathed. All eyes rested on Tiny Tim. "And," continued Bob Cratchit, "we still have Tiny Tim." The family looked at Tiny Tim in silence. "And now Mr. Scrooge has given me a pay rise. We can look forward to an even better year. A toast to our good friend and benefactor, Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge." A big cheer could be heard halfway down the street. "What's going on?" screamed the ghost. "I keep telling you, your year's out of date. This is ridiculous." Scrooge's eyes grew fuzzy, and he awoke at the sound of the church bell striking 2. He pulled back the curtains surrounding his bed and realized there was a bright light shining under the door from the next room. "Come on in," a voice said. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present. You have never seen the likes of me before." "Not you, but I have enjoyed these last 7 Christmases." "What do you mean?" "I told Marley and I told the ghost of Christmas past that I celebrate Christmas. I help as many as I can to celebrate, and what is more, I help people throughout the year. So what am I doing here? The ghost said. Better still is, what am I doing here? I changed 7 years ago. You've got terrible admin. I may have been obnoxious, but I changed. I keep Christmas. Well, I'm booked now, so we might as well go through the motions, if that's all right with you. Might as well, sighed Scrooge. Scrooge's eyes grew fuzzy, and when things got clearer, they were standing in the front room of the Cratchit house. Martha's running a bit late. Where is she? Said Bob. The children, looking out of the window, all cried, Here she is! You're late, dear, scolded Mrs. Cratchit. Yes, I'm sorry. We had to clear away. Here's my wages, Mother. Oh, 5 shillings. That is wonderful, Martha. Come on, Martha. Come and hear the pudding bubble in the scullery. Bob waited till they had left before he spoke to Mrs. Cratchit. You know, my dear, if Martha was to work down the docks, she could make so much more money easing the plight of lonely seamen. No, dear, not my Martha. She's fine where she is. Okay, my dear, just saying she could be sitting on a fortune. Tiny Tim, who had been overlooked, sitting in the corner, said, How would one ease a seaman's plight? Never you mind, Bob said. It got very foggy, and when it had cleared, they were in his nephew Fred's living room. You did remind your uncle that Christmas dinner would be at 3. Yes, I told him he'll be here. What's this? Why is this information so out of date? The ghost asked. Because you have a rubbish admin who won't do their filing. That's why. I told Marley, and I'm telling you, I'm a reformed character. I look after my clerk and my family. The spirit waved his hands, and they were standing back in Bob Cratchit's house. Oh no, not here again. I could do with getting some sleep. Bob Cratchit pushed himself away from the table. That was some blowout, and undid the buttons of his waistcoat. Would you like some more wine, Father? Yes, just a drop. Careful, Bob. You have work in the morning. It's okay, Mr. Scrooge said. I could come in midday. The spirit looked at Scrooge. I told you, a reformed character. That's me, smiled Scrooge. Oh, I forgot. Gather round, everyone. I have some great news. The family looked on expectantly. I have secured Tiny Tim a position. Oh, how wonderful, everyone said. Tiny Tim looked apprehensive. Oh, do tell, Father, Belinda said. From next week, Tiny Tim will be employed by the Islington Exhaust Centre. The family gave a loud cheer, except for Tiny Tim. Do you mean I am to become a chimney sweep, Father? Yes. Tiny Tim pursed his lips and looked sullen. Now then, let's toast the benefactor of our feast. Let's raise our glasses to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge. Aha! Just see what your bad behavior has forced your clerk to do. It's forced him to let his son climb chimneys. It's nothing to do with me, said Scrooge indignantly. The ghost of Christmas present waved his hand, and Scrooge found himself back in his bed. At last, a chance to sleep. Scrooge awoke, startled by the dark presence at the foot of his bed. I suppose you're the ghost of Christmas to come. The ghost nodded and waved its arm. They appeared yet again in Cratchit's living room. A little crutch leaned against the fireplace. Bob Cratchit sat by the fire. It'll seem odd this Christmas without Tiny Tim. Yes, poor mite, said Mrs. Cratchit. If only after climbing up that chimney he'd not climbed out onto the roof to admire the view. Yes, and without his crutch to steady him, had plummeted 60 feet to the ground. Bob looked at Tiny Tim's crutch. He picked it up and looked lovingly at it, then broke it into two across his knee and popped the pieces on the fire. Should give off a fair bit of heat, that should. And he warmed his hands. The ghost seemed to look on a lot longer than the other ghosts. It waved its arm, and the fog descended, and when it dissipated, they were at a funeral. Fred, Scrooge's nephew, stood at a lectern. Tears streamed down his face. My Uncle Ebenezer Scrooge was one of the nicest, kindest, generous men I ever knew. A roar of assent made Scrooge turn and saw a jam-packed church. He was that, said someone, and the congregation roared approval. The ghost of Christmas come, veiled so its features could not be seen, just uttered, and with a wave, Scrooge was back in bed. Light streamed through the curtains, through the curtainless windows. Woohoo! Christmas morning! His stint at the local orphanage was a big hit. Every boy and girl got a toy and a hearty Christmas dinner, all washed down with lots of hot gin punch. As one of the orphanage carers said, put the little buggers to sleep early so we can have our Christmas fun. Christmas dinner with Fred family and friends was a big hit, but Scrooge felt there was something he had to say to Bob Cratchit tomorrow regarding Tiny Tim. The following day, Scrooge took Bob Cratchit for a seasonal drink of smoking bishop at the local tavern. Scrooge thought it was best just to come out with it. Look, Bob, I don't mean to stick my nose into how you bring up your children. I had a dream, and in this dream you got Tiny Tim a job cleaning chimneys. I didn't think it's a suitable occupation for a handicapped child. Bob looked amazed. How did Scrooge know about the Islington Exhaust Centre? Maybe it was just one of those crazy dreams. His mind wandered back to that morning's conversation with Tiny Tim. Father, I have something to tell you. Bob furrowed his brow. Yes, Tim, I do not wish to climb chimneys. Instead, I'd like to ease a lonely seaman's plight. Well, Tim, that's quite arduous work. Are you sure you're up to it? Yes, Father. I started working on the docks this morning, and I've made £7 3 shillings and twopence halfpenny. Tim emptied his pockets onto the kitchen table, and Bob's eyes widened at all the silver coins. Here, Tim, sit and help me count it. If it's all the same to you, Father, I'd rather stand. No, Mr. Scrooge, your concern is noted. I can tell you that Tiny Tim is not to clean chimneys and has requested he follow a naval occupation. Scrooge and Bob Cratchit raised their tankards. God bless us, everyone. Hope you liked the story. Merry Christmas. I hope you'll subscribe, share, and anyway, just a Merry Christmas. I hope you have a lovely time and a very, very happy and healthy New Year. And I'll see you in 2025. All the best now. Bye-bye.